Hello everybody, I'm Mark from Overlanding Forward and welcome back to the channel. Apologise for the scary hair, but we're sitting here on a coastline on the Baltic coast in Estonia, getting absolutely bombarded with wind blowing in this way. And as you can see from the white tops of the waves, it's pretty brutal. So the car has been parked as sort of like a shelter here against the side of the tent, to give us some sort of barrier against the wind, but we've been buffeted today. But it's quite warm actually, even though that it's quite windy and the sun's out. So it's actually a very nice day. It's just extremely windy with about 30-mile gusts coming in off the Baltic. So today, what am I going to talk about? So I'm going to talk about the 5 things that you need to look for when buying an L322. Now I've had this thing now for probably 20 months. I've documented, quite honestly, the good, the bad and the indifferent on this vehicle, and some of the sort of nightmare things that some people think that has happened when the engine decided to give up on me, or rather the turbos blew up on me. So I'm not going to go into the engine issues I've had, but I want to give you some 5 things and some tips to look for when you're looking for one of these vehicles. Now, you know from looking at the channel, there's different aspects of the channel that I have. I got the L322 and how I've built this into more of an overland build and some of the things that I've done to it. There's also aspects of my channel that talks about things like the trips and then also gear reviews. And I know it's not all for everybody, but clearly some of the most watched videos I have around when I talk about the L322. Now, I don't consider myself to be an expert on this vehicle. I think I'm knowledgeable about it. I've learned to live with the nuances of how this thing runs, the good, the bad and the indifferent. I really can't find a lot of bad and all this negative troll BS that goes along with these types of things. I think that's because, to be honest with you, I think it's Land Rover envy. I think a lot of people would love to have one but can't afford one. So I'm not going to go into the issues around those things, but here are the 5 things that I have that I think might help you. So number 1, rust. Now, I don't live in a salt belt, but I definitely know from my time living into the States when I had one of these, a 2003 model, within 3 or 4 years, it was absolutely punished with salt in the wintertime in and around the Boston area. So, you know, salt goes down on the road to get rid of all of the ice and the snow and things like that. It really does punish these vehicles. Now, I know I went through 3 sets of calipers on the front seizing up because of rust. Now, you could argue that that could be a quality issue around the way that the calipers and everything are sort of made with aluminium and with steel. But anyway, they take a punishing. So on the rust, you know, specifically with this vehicle, which will be 13 years old in November, I've got rust bubbling up on strange places. So if you look here at the B-roll, so on the driver's side door, right where the sort of the molding goes, I've got some rust bubbling up there. I'm not really sure where this happened. I think it could be a chip and then the rust has bubbled up underneath it. It could also be water going in through the channels in the windows, although the seals and the rubbers on the top of the windows here where the door is are in pretty good condition. But I have some rust bubbling up here which would need to get taken care of. Rust has appeared on the lip of the driver's side upper part of the bonnet, and you can see here where that has bubbled up. Now that one looks quite serious, and I think that I'm going to need to get these 2 taken care of. So rust does appear. Now for me, the other places that appear is on the upper end, leading edge of the tailgate, so the upper part of the tailgate. So I have no rust on my tailgate, upper or lower at all. The other thing that I have is that it begins to appear in the wheel well on the load space. And where that happens, it's all obviously spot welded and seamed. And there are a number of seams that go down the side of the rails on the chassis or part of the monocoque. And over a period of time, I think what happens is that the seams begin to sort of eat the way out in. There's a lot of trays and everything. There's a heat shield under there for the exhaust, and I think water gets in there over a period of time and muck gets underneath those heat shields, and then it begins to work its way through the seams that sort of join the part of the load space together. So what I've done with mine, I got a whole series of different types of product in there to neutralize the rust and then I put this heavy duty black seam sealer over the top of it to sort of stop it going anymore. Now I can't show you it because clearly I've got my load space in the back, but I went right the way through anything. There was some rust beginning to appear, but it wasn't severe. It was definitely surface rust. So again, I treated all of those seams where those chassis rails are on the monocoque, both sides, and then heavily coated it with some seam sealer rust inhibitor to get rid of it. Now the other place that it happens is on the rear arches. Now I've got rock sliders on mine, and when the original plastic trims that go at the bottom of the seals came off, we made sure that the whole lot was rust neutralized, and then I put a seam seal coat over the top of it. So both ends, there was no severe rust there. It looked like it was beginning to form, but it was all surface. So I don't have any problems with the rear wheel arches, which is a notorious rust spot for these things. Now, one thing I would recommend with rust, especially on the rear, take both inner liners out. Especially if you're buying one or if you have one, take both of them out. That will give you access to the leading edge of the rear wheel arch, where it starts just on the other side of where the C pillar is and goes back. Then you can get in there and have a real good look at what the problem potentially could be. It's probably a weekend job to drop both of the splash guards down, go in there and put rust inhibitor on it, and then seam seal it. Put anything you want, any good product in there. Lanagard is a really good product once you've done that, and it should neutralize it and you should be good to go. So anyway, number one is rust. I would seriously look at all those different points or those rust traps. They're notorious on these vehicles. So number two, and these are really not in any specific order, number two is modifications. Now, I'm guilty of this just the same as probably anybody else is. Now, this is a 2010 facelifted last of the L322s, as those of you follow the channel know. I have a number of things that have done to this vehicle that have modified it. So if anybody was to look at buying this vehicle stock, well, good luck, because I've done many things that have changed this vehicle. So let's go through the obvious ones. For me, you can look at the side vents and realize those side vents come from the original version of the 2003 to 2006. Why? Because I like the way the two fins look on the side vents, and I've got that little red stripe. Now that was because, to me, the original ones were the classic ones. That sort of even followed through to the new Range Rover and the old 405s. So for me, it looked like to just return it to that. The latter ones in the supercharged and what came with this vehicle just looked too complicated to me. And I just wasn't a big fan of it. Now that's personal choice, but anyway, I modified mine. The other thing is, a lot of the things that came with this vehicle, I never liked the gray, fake chrome, glossy look on this vehicle. It just didn't look right. So I changed my grille to black. Lots of the things on the trim pieces that you have around the top of the bonnet vent where the air intake is, I sprayed mine black. Things like on the lower leading edge of the rear upper tailgate, that one you can get in black. So for me, it was really around aesthetics and just getting rid of these mismatched chrome, gunmetal gray trim on the vehicle. Now, the good thing is you can go to places like Powerful UK and you can pretty much make any model vehicle look any different age. Now, it's easier to go up, meaning you can take a 2006 and then put a 2010 facelift on the front if that's what you want to do. It's difficult to go back. So you can definitely change all this trim work, but again, it starts distracting away from what was factory. So for me, modifications are one thing to look at. Now, I've seen videos on YouTube of people that have bought 2006 versions that have new lights, new grills, new bumpers, and things like that that are put onto those vehicles to make them look like they're a 2010. If that is not your cup of tea, then I suggest you go buy the model completely unmolested. Personally, if you want a 2010, they're cheap enough. Go get a 2010 and get the facelifted version instead of taking all the time, effort, money to change the bumpers and the lights and all of that stuff. It's not easy to do. It ends up costing a lot of money. And if you are the next person that wants to buy that vehicle, you really have to make sure that they did it correctly, because there's quite a lot of rebolting, drilling, all those sorts of things happen, and you have no idea of the quality of the work. So just be careful of modifications that are not stock on the vehicle that you're buying, and try and stick as stock as you possibly can. Now, on that subject, this vehicle clearly has got a number of things where you look at the fit panels, especially of the bumpers front and rear, and if you look at my rear bumper, there is a gap that has appeared as well. Now, I've had that bumper off, and I'm not sure if it's got put back on properly or there's some clips that have missed or popped out, but clearly I've got a gap there and I need to go and address that. On the front, on the passenger side front, there is a gap there too. Now, I know what's caused that is because when I had the accident, that accident took the bumper off, and there are definitely clips and things like that that were missing. And so I know why that is there, and I know how to push it back. It will not sit properly because I think some brackets in there are cracked, broken, or bent, even though I've tried to put it back. So when you look at these vehicles, look at the gaps. They should be almost perfect. I mean, the vehicle here is a 2010. Land Rover's gap, where you can put pretty much this whole hand through some of the gaps in some of the previous models, should not exist in this vehicle. So if you see vastly different gap sizes on the doors, on the bonnets, where the bonnet meets the wings, question why it's like that. Now, one thing that I know comes up over and over again, and one of the biggest criticisms of these vehicles, is around the suspension, the air suspension specifically, but let's talk about suspension. So if you're looking at these vehicles, go through, get the vehicle up off the ground and start figuring out where the upper or lower control arm bushes have gone, or the ball joints in them have gone. Now, they're not expensive to change. All of mine, front, lower, upper, both sides have been done on the front. The only thing I've not done with mine is the anti-roll bar or anything there. And I know I've got a clonk going on that I'm pretty sure has got to do with the links between where the top of the anti-roll bar goes to the bottom of where it's connected. And those are ball joints on those links. They're really inexpensive. They're like 30 quid for two. And there's only two on them. And I believe what's happening is that the anti-roll bar is going, and those links are beginning to move. And I'm pretty sure that probably the bushings on the anti-roll bar at the front are knackered anyway. But those things are relatively inexpensive to look at. So things like clunking and banging and things like that you get with these vehicles, again, they're heavy, they need attention, and you need to look for them. So if you are looking at one of those vehicles and you've not seen those things done within the previous 2 years, chances are they're probably going to need doing. But this is just service items, to be honest with you. Ball joints, bushings, things like that. Once you do them, you're probably going to get a good 5 years, use out of them, because they're not going to go, unless you're punishing the vehicle or putting it through really high mileage, generally they're going to last a little bit longer. On suspension as well, also look at things like subframe bushes. If you go back to the video that I'll link up here, which is everything the work that was done on this vehicle when it was out for 6 months, my rear subframe bushings are completely disintegrated, and there are a large chunk of metal and rubber at the back. All four of them had gone, where to the point where the whole thing was just sagging down, and I could hear it clunking and banging. So all of my rebuild of all of the things at the back, any ball joints, anti-roll bar, bushings, links, all of that was done as well. And I think this goes to the experience of the vehicle. If you know those things go at a period of time and you don't know that they've actually been replaced and you don't have any receipts for them, the chances are they probably need doing. So have a look at that. Now, the other thing when you talk about suspension is the air suspension. Now, yes, they are prone to a common fault is leaking. Now, with me, there are a number of things I think you need to look at is the age of the bags on the vehicle. Now, I can see in from underneath my wheel arches the stamps on them of how old they are. So the two at the front are Bilsteins, although the driver's side bag is an Arnott replacement bag because the other one started to leak. But that's the other thing. Just if the bag starts leaking and you know the strut is in good condition, you can just get a replacement bag. You pop the thing off, they're really easy to do. There's 3 bolts on the top of the turret, and there's also 2 bolts that hold it onto the axle itself, onto the stub axle. So they're really easy to do. They're not that complicated, despite what people might think. So take a look at things like that. On the 10 to 12 model, these are active suspension. So you get a different type of damper because of the way that it's controlled. A common fault you see with these things is you end up with all of the dash warning lights going on, all in yellow around, all of the height gets stopped, you cannot put it into different modes. Generally, 9 times out of 10, it's because of the 2 wires that go from the top of the suspension turret on either side. Those wires, if it's original, would just had 2 wires going into the top of the shock. 9 times out of 10, those wires have got hard because of the heat underneath the bonnet, and they've started to sort of break down. I've had both of mine go at different times. That one went back in January about 1.5 years ago, or 2 years ago, and this one on the driver's side, I just happened to notice it. Now, I did take them up to protect it on this side, but they're really cheap. They're about 25 quid to get. If you've not replaced them, they are sheathed now, the new replacement ones. It's not just 2 wires, they actually have a sheathing on them. My advice to you is carry one as a spare if you've not replaced them, or just replace them both. 50 quid. It takes maybe 20 minutes to replace them. It's a really simple plug and play operation. So that's part of the suspension as well. One last thing I'll point out is the air tank is buried on the chassis rails down underneath the driver's side. I took mine out probably last summer, so it's been out about 12 months. So that is 12 years worth of crud up underneath that thing. The bottom doesn't look like it's disturbed. When it came out, I did it with Will at Utopia, so all of the paint had come off. It had just been completely eroded by all of the crap that got up over the top of the tank. It was an absolute bastard to get it out, because the mounting bolts, there's 2 on the front, 2 in the rear, we couldn't get them out. It took a horrendous amount of time to get the rear ones out, but eventually we did. It was a combination of just hammering away at them, grinding them down to be able to get them out. And to be honest with you, there's only 2 bolts holding it up, and it's on opposed. There's one on the inboard side, one on the outboard side, purely because all of the countersunk nuts in there were just rusted up. But it's fine, it's only holding air. 2 of them up there will keep it in place, so I'm happy with that. They're really inexpensive, and they're like 150 quid. Sometimes I believe that you get air leaks from the top of that tank, and if it's really bad, like the leading edge on the driver's side was terrible at the top. You can clearly see that you could touch it and you could hear it and tap it. The metal sounded like it was on its way out, and I think a lot of leaks could come from things like that. Now with this vehicle, I've had no leaks from any of the valves and everything buried underneath where the suspension is. So on this one, they sit this side of the wheel arches, and at the back they're buried away. I'm not sure where they are on the back, but those valve blocks and control blocks for moving the air backwards and forwards, I don't think they've given me any problems, but they might have given other people problems. So the last component of that is the compressor. So the compressor is buried at the back in the load space where the spare wheel is. And the warning sign for me was, I was in Spain when I first took it to Spain. I went off-road. Every time I tried to get into high mode or raise it up, it would take a lot longer to actually pump itself up, and I would begin to get warnings coming and saying raising slowly, or I was getting message like compressor hot, wait for it to cool down. And you could hear it making strange noises in the back. And I'm pretty sure that's when these things start to go wrong, is when the compressor, if you don't know, age unknown, my guess is you'll probably see that as the cause of most of the problems you have with the air suspension on the L322. So the next issue is to do with electrics with this vehicle, and I know they get hammered about how fickle they are, and that's really not true, to be honest with you. My experience, touch wood, has been that I've not had any electrical problems with this vehicle. Now I know some people do, but I think that is a primary cause of people buggering around with these things and either tapping into fuse boxes or tapping into certain things within the vehicle, probably not knowing what they're doing. It's not done professionally, and I think that's where you end up with strange electrical problems. Fundamentally, these vehicles are strong electrically. Now I know a few people might tell me that I'm wrong. Well, that's not true. I'm right. Fundamentally, they were built really well, good solid electrics. All the components in them are pretty much robust. As soon as people start dicking around with this stuff, that's when I think you end up with problems and you end up with strange faults. The older the vehicle, the more messing about, the more faults you're going to get. I'm sorry, it's just reality. So one thing I learned that I was unaware of is that when this thing went in for its engine problems, Tim at Emporium said to me, Mark, you've got the wrong battery. Now, I live in London. I can't always get backwards and forwards, and I've started to have electrical problems with it, meaning battery related issues. So the first battery that was in this vehicle that I bought it wouldn't start one day. Tested the battery. I called Halfords, who can do a local switch for me. It was easy to do. Came in and dumped a battery in it. It wasn't an AGM battery, and then gradually during that first summer I had it, it wouldn't start. Sometimes you'd hear it click. You'd also get messages come up on the screen about low voltage, and I always thought it was a bad battery. And I thought, well, this is strange, because did I end up with 2 or 3 bad batteries? And Tim said to me, any of the vehicles that have digital dashes must have an AGM battery. And since that was switched out from a non-AGM battery back to an AGM battery, again, touch wood, I've had no problems at all with anything. Now, one thing to remember with the later versions is that from the 10 to 11, somehow Range Rover, Land Rover decided that every time you open up your driver's door, you need to power the vehicle on, and all ECUs need to wake up until you hit the start button. The peripheral ones need to wake up. Most of the time you want to reach into your vehicle, grab something, close the door. But of course all ECUs power up. You can actually hear some of them powering up. You get this whirring sound under the dash, not sure what it is. And so a lot of the ECUs just fire themselves up on the anticipation that the only reason why you're in here is you're going to start the vehicle. Well, sometimes you don't do that. I've had one instance of battery problems, and again, once you do it once, you generally never do it again, was when I was installing my new load space, probably about a year ago. I had all doors open, the tailgate was open, didn't think twice about it. I was in and out of the vehicle, and so when the interior lights come on, I drained the battery in a day, completely drained. So the following day when we tried to that evening when I tried to fire this thing up to move it out the driveway, dead. So I had to put a charger on it. And I think that is purely because, and a lot of people fall into this, so if you open the doors on this vehicle, specifically the driver's door, it will wake everything up in anticipation to start. If you keep opening it, closing it, opening it, closing it, you're going to drain the battery pretty quickly. So just be aware of that. I always now turn off all of the interior lights. If they're on, and they're on for any period of time, I think they begin to start sucking it. So you have to remember that all of the interior lights, it's not just one here and one at the back here, it's all of the door lights and the puddle lights. There's lights underneath the bottom of the dash here. There's a ton of lights. And so you've got to remember, so although I've changed mine to LED, they're still pulling power. And if your car's sat for a couple of days and you're in and out of the vehicle and it's not had a charge or a run, then you know your battery is going to start taking some charge from it. So the biggest thing that I can see around electrical issues that you get is really to do with batteries. If you start seeing strange warning signs appearing, 9 times out of 10, guarantee you it's got something to do with low voltage. And low voltage could be many different things. It could be a battery on its way out. It could be a bad earth. When this engine came out, they found out that the earth strap was not very good. It was rust on it as well. That was all cleaned up. They believe that could have some problems with starting as well. So all of these things sort of generally lead back to potentially voltage battery problems. Now with that, on the battery issue and having strange messages appear on your dash, I would highly recommend you get a gap tool, because that could save a huge amount of guesswork. Because 9 times out of 10, if you plug your gap tool in and you see the messages that pop up, you'll see other messages that are connected through on the CAN bus network, which would indicate that there are voltage problems. And if you see voltage type messages appear inside of the gap tool, the chances are it's a battery related issue or a voltage related issue than something else that could happen as well. So yes, it's not electrical issues, but most of the time it's got something to do with the battery. So the last thing I'll talk about is things like turbos and EGRs. Now this one has been remapped where the EGR itself has been turned off. I've seen pictures of the state of the EGR valve with this when it was all pulled apart. It wasn't too bad. I've seen pictures of far worse but they generally go about 100,000 miles. Now there's one EGR valve on this one. There are two turbos, and clearly the one on the driver's side is the one that boosts and you use the most. When you really hit it, go over 2,000 RPM, then the secondary turbo will kick in for you. So there are known EGR problems generally around about 100,000 miles to be able to go fix this, and depending on the model depends on how many you have. This one has one. The model with the V8 3.6 I think it is has two, purely because the way the way the turbos are made. This one has got double stack turbos. So if you have an L322, a diesel one specifically, you're going to run into EGRs. Now whether you have two or whether you have one, chances are over 100,000 miles you're going to have to look at having them taken out, new ones put in. Now you can also go down the EGR delete, but that's up to you as personal choice if you want to go down that route. So be aware of that. To take them in and out, you're probably looking at a couple of grand to be able to get in there and replace them. So those do go, and clearly with this vehicle, with the problems I had, I blew both my turbos. Now there is a video out there from Harry's Garage with Clarkson talking about his. His is a model before this one. I think his is an 08. Both his turbos blew at the same time as well, and I think generally what happens with these is whatever symptoms it is that starts to make the turbos go to that point, they both go at the same time. So I don't think you end up with one or the other, they both end up going. So that is something to be aware of. Refurbished turbos from Garrett are £1,200 each. So just be aware of that, and it's an engine out job. So you have to make sure that you sort of budget for two refurbished turbos, 2.5 grand, plus the labor to do it. So it's going to cost quite a lot if they're on their way out. Now this one apparently had its turbos replaced at about 100,000 miles. I'm up to, where did mine go? Mine probably lasted about 50,000. So if they were replaced, and they were replaced at 100,000, this one's sitting at 152,000. I've probably done about 2,000 on this trip, but generally they only lasted 50,000. To this day, we still don't know the problems that actually created both my turbos to go. There could be many different issues. Again, I point back to piss poor maintenance, piss poor management of something at that point. There could have been bodges, corners cut, which we know from when all of this stuff got pulled apart. But just be aware of that they do go. And if you don't have receipts, or even if you do, in my case, it still doesn't mean that they're not going to go at some point in time. So be aware of that. You can get a oil drain kit for these vehicles as well. So when all of that work was done, I went and got the oil changed and then drained the oil out of the drain kit for the turbos. So anything for those new turbos, any sort of metal, anything like that on their first startup for the first 1,000 miles, that was all drained out. And the guys that I ran down and got it done locally just had a look at the oil that came out of the turbos and said, no, it's clean. But it's something to be aware of. If you don't have that drain kit, I'd highly recommend you go get somebody to put it in, because I do think it will prolong the life of the turbos for you. So that's my 5 things for you with a freebie thrown in. So rust, go and have a look at all the rust points for this vehicle. The older they are, the worse they're going to be. The newer they are, probably a lot of those prone areas have been treated or taken care of as the model progressed down through its life. The suspension issues I mentioned, any knocking, banging, anything like that is probably 9 times out of 10 to do with the control arms, upper or lower, on the front. They do have them on the back, so they could go on the back as well. So bushings at the back are notorious to go, so take a look at those. Battery issues, make sure you have the right battery for the right vehicle. I fell foul to that. Make sure that the battery you have is of the right one for the right vehicle, right cranking amps, and carry a NOCO battery boost. I love those things. Highly suggest you get one that will turn over the vehicle that you need. They will save you if you run into battery issues. You can actually get remote plugs on them. I have one on this vehicle where all I do is take the NOCO, plug it into the back on the connector. I don't have to carry crocodile clips. Hit the button, hear the relay go, bang, works. I've done it once. It's been a lifesaver for me. Mods, just be careful and know the model and the way that the different facelifts over the lifespan of the vehicle evolved. And if you start seeing things like ill-fitting bonnets to bumpers, bumpers to wings, you know something has happened at some point in time. The quality when these things came out of the factory was top notch. All of those things that you might think about old legacy classic Range Rovers, when you can get your fist down the doors, in the gaps in the doors, they are not present on these vehicles. They simply are not. Now, over periods of time, things do shift. Like my bonnet was off when this vehicle had its engine out, and I don't think it's been aligned 100% because it's just skimming the door. And I think it's just one of those things, when you put it back on and it looks okay, those things, when things start getting removed, that's when they go out of alignment from when they came away from the factory. So just be aware of those things and double check it if you're looking for that. And then the turbo and the EGR issues, especially if you have a diesel vehicle with EGRs, turbos, superchargers. Everyone knows that the 5-litre supercharge has problems with all of the valve chains and all of the timing gear and things like that. Go on the internet, research what that looks like, find out whether it's been done. I don't have one, so I can't comment on supercharged vehicles, but they're going to have problems, and the older they are, you've got to remember that people love booting those things. You've got all of that horsepower sitting there under your right foot, and I wouldn't be surprised as the older those vehicles get and as they go through many different types of ownerships, someone at some point drove it for an Italian tune-up and did it consistently. So you might end up finding vehicles like that. But I also believe, and here is the other freebie for this, these vehicles are of huge value. And by that, this one itself was close to £90,000 10, 12 years ago when it first came off the factory. Today, you can pick them up for 8 to 10. You can get ones even cheaper than that, and definitely with the supercharged in Europe, with the cost of petrol is even lower. So there are some huge bargains to be had on these vehicles. Now, whether you like this or like the L405 or with the P38 or the Classic, to me, this is the best Range Rover, besides the original two-door Classic, ever made. Hands down, these vehicles are superb. However, as I've said many, many times, you need to take care of them. If you take care of them, they will take care of you. Just because it was a very expensive vehicle that cost a huge amount of money when it finally rolled off that production line means you have to love and care for it. They're big, they're bulky, they're heavy. Things like brake pads will go probably doubly quicker than a normal car, especially the fronts. You have to make sure you keep up on the maintenance schedules. Do what I do. Go change all of the fluids, every single piece of fluid on this vehicle every year. Diffs, engine oil, clean your filters, clean your pollen filter, get your gearbox oil flushed. You don't need to do a full flush. Get the gearbox oil changed, put in a new filter, especially as they get older. Just do it. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it can actually help prevent a gearbox breakdown. Get the diffs done. Any way you've got fluid on these vehicles, oil, change it. The power steering, go and do things like every couple of years, flush out all the brake lines. There's all this crap that's probably been sitting there over a period of time where maintenance has been neglected. But just go do it. And my advice would be is what I've done with every vehicle. I did it when I had the Defender. I did it when I had this. I always go back and say the day I bought it is 0 day. And then I go right the way through and get every single ounce of fluid out of this vehicle. And then I know what my own maintenance schedule will be going forward. I've got no idea whether somebody just bullshitted me and said, yeah, the oil was changed every 3,000 miles. I now know going forward, I will change the oil every 3,000 to 5,000, or I will get a gearbox oil changed every year with a new filter. All of that goes into my own maintenance schedule to try and prolong the life of the vehicle. I very rarely drive this thing over 70 miles an hour. Every now and again, I will do as everybody suggests with the DPF, is I will boot it a couple of times to clean it all out by going over 2,000 RPM. And there are a few times for, 10 minutes, I'll take it up to 80, 85, depending on where I am, of course, and clear all that out. The worst thing for these vehicles, if you fire them up and do short runs, those of you that end up with DPF problems, generally that's because this thing has started, not warmed up, driven to on the school run, gone to the shops, closed down, moisture builds up, you just end up prolonging the problem. So anyway, those are my 5 things, plus the mod freebie. So if you want one of these vehicles, there's plenty of information on the internet of what to look for. That's my personal opinion of coming up on 2 years of ownership with this one. I've got videos all over my channel about how reliable they are, things to look out for, different model variations, all those sorts of things, and I hope they will be of use to you. Thank you very much for watching. Please, if you like the video, just like the video, share it with your friends. Don't forget to click and subscribe. And with that, I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.